You can buy bias tape already made for you and double folded, or you can make your own. So today, in this video, I'm going to show you how you can make your very own bias tape that will actually match your fabric or your garment or your project. That's all coming up next on Simple Sewing Secrets. You don't have to have a lot of fabric to make a bias tape. This is just a scrap piece that I have. And the reason it's called bias because the fabric has 3 different directions. You have your warp thread, which is the lengthwise grain. You have your weft threads, which is a crosswise grain. And you have your bias, which is the diagonal of the fabric, and it stretches. And that's where bias tape got its name. It's because it's cut on the bias of the fabric. So now we got to figure out where do we get the bias and how do we get to it. Easy way to do that. Just take one corner of your fabric and fold it to meet the other side. And when you do that, you have found the bias right here on the edge. So this is where you would cut your bias tape or your seam binding. So now, if I had a larger piece of fabric, this bias would be longer. So I'm just going to go ahead and just cut this in a square. Okay, so now we got that cut in a square. You can now see that bias. Let me open it back up again. So here we've got a perfect square. Fold it over where the corners meet, and you now have the bias. So to cut your seam binding, you just want to cut along that bias. And now that gives you a couple of triangles. So you can lay them on top of each other because I like to cut multiples. Now, the bias fabric that we already had here, we're going to measure it and see how wide it is. And that way you can kind of have an idea of how wide you want your bias tape, because you can make it as wide as you want. This one is actually 1 3/4 of an inch. I like to do 1.5 inches, and this one's pretty wide. This ends up being a 1/2 inch seam binding, and they have turned inside. One side has 3/8 and the other side has 1/4 inch. So I'm going to do mine 1.5 inches. Now there's several ways you can do this. You can just take your ruler or your seam gauge, you can lay it down and you can mark 1.5 inches all the way across. This is one way of measuring it. And that way you have a line, and then you could take your ruler if you wanted to. And you could take the ruler and you could connect the lines so that they're all straight. So that will give you your 2 inch, your 1.5 inch seam binding. Or once you've measured from the beginning, if you don't want to write or draw, you can measure 1.5 inches, and I got my lines off a little bit, but that's okay. You can measure 1.5 inches, start cutting, and then you can take the bias and fold it on itself and continue to cut. And as you fold it, you get more and more. And that way you know you got it perfectly straight. As you see, my line was not perfectly straight. But you keep doing this until you get to the other side of the bias tape. And that's how simple and easy it is to cut your own bias tape. Now, to get it so that you can actually use it, you want to take it and fold it in half and then press it in half like this. And then once you press it in half, you'll press each seam to meet the center. So I'm going to go ahead and press that so you can see how that's done. So here's our strip. And as I mentioned, you're just going to take the iron and you're going to fold the bias tape or strip in half, and you're just going to iron it flat just like that, and that gives you that center fold. So now you want to unfold it just like so, and when I unfold it, I kind of like to press it down a little flatter, and then you open it back up, and then that gives you your line where you're going to actually take your bias and fold it in on each side. You can actually fold all the way to the center, and that's going to give you a smaller binding with, or you can actually fold them in just slightly, but don't fold them directly to the line because it'll be bulky. So now you'll just take your iron and you'll just fold it down. And you'll do the same thing on the other side. Get mine a little straight there. And this time I'm going to do them both at the same time. You might want to turn off your steam so you don't burn yourself, because the steam will constantly be coming in front of you and it'll burn your hand. And so now that you got that done, then you'll just take it and fold it back in half this time and press it down. And there we're done. And that's how easy it is to make your own bias tape. I hope this tip has been helpful and I hope you try it. Happy sewing!